Lenny Steinhorn, he's a professor of communications, political analyst also, American history professor also at American University. Paul Schiff Berman, you saw him at 6 o'clock. You've seen him here before on Off Script, law professor at George Washington University. Lenny, let me start with you. Your takeaway from the report.
Well, let's take away all the legal matters for a second. What's the bar we want our president to cross over in this country? Is the bar simply that he's not committed criminal conspiracy, that the Attorney General in this particular case can't find evidence of obstruction of justice that he says could be indictable? Is that the bar we want, or do we want to raise that bar higher? And that's what the Mueller Report faces every American with that question. When you look at the accumulated evidence in there of a president who asked his aides to lie, and many of them did lie because of that. Some of them refused to lie because they otherwise would have resigned. They thought it was against their values. A president who basically attacked the press for issuing reports that he knew were true. Is that what we want in the White House? That's what I think the American people have to ask themselves.
Yeah. Paul, help us out here. Give me the legal spin on this.
Yeah, so I do care about the law, but I agree with you that the standard of evidence that the special counsel and that Attorney General Barr used is not the only way to look at the first set of charges, which is the evidence of coordination with regard to the Russia probe. And there's tremendous amount of evidence there of a large number of contacts with the Trump campaign and coordination. What they didn't find is specific evidence of agreement. But actually, the federal election laws, the regulations implementing them, don't actually require agreement, so they're using a standard beyond what a federal election law even requires. And then with regard to obstruction, it's very clear that Mueller did, in fact, find sufficient evidence for obstruction, but for the Justice Department's own policy that a sitting president can't be indicted. Mueller essentially concludes that, but for that, there would be enough evidence to pursue an obstruction of justice charge, and that's a really serious thing to say that the president on 10 different occasions actually tried to shut down an investigation into an important counterintelligence attack on our country is kind of amazing.
And for people who try to dismiss what you just said, we should also point out that the special counsel also had the authority to exonerate the president, find out that there was no criminal wrongdoing, and he chose not to do that.
And indeed, he said, I would say that if I could say that,
right,
but I can't.
Okay, so it now moves to Capitol Hill. Okay, it goes from the criminal prosecution arena to the political arena. What can we expect on Capitol Hill?
Well, in many ways, that's what a special counsel was doing here, which is to kick it to Congress because it becomes a political issue as to whether the president has committed impeachable offenses and how you define impeachable offenses. So if your only definition of an impeachable offense is whether the president could be indicted, that's one level. But I think the other level is, what's his conduct as a candidate and president of the United States? Was he doing the exact same things you were talking about, trying to impede an investigation? So even if the Attorney General says he's not to be indicted on this, does it constitute the types of offenses, high crimes and misdemeanors that would lead to impeachment? They're not going to go down that path. But that's the big issue laying in front of everyone, which is, what was the president's conduct, and is it appropriate for the office?
And the other, I think, big issue that still is outstanding is there now should never again be any dispute that Russia did engage in a very sophisticated, sustained effort, successful effort to hack into our election process, our social media outlets, and so forth. And so no one can ever say that this was a witch hunt, or that this didn't take place, or that Russia was not involved, and hopefully we can take steps so that this never again happens.
That's what you would expect the president to do now. I mean, if the president really feels that he's been exonerated, turn your attention to Russia and let's fix this.
That's right.
And also not to say that he believes Vladimir Putin in his denials. I mean, that whole Helsinki news conference was actually startling because much of the information in this Mueller report was exactly what the intelligence community was saying all along. In fact, it's what the media were saying all along. And for the president to go after and attack the media as an enemy of the American people when he knew many of these stories were accurate, shame on him.
The final thing I think I just want to say is that it's clear Mueller has listed a whole number of times in which the president and the president's people have lied to the press, lied to the American people. They didn't do it under oath, so it's not perjury. But one of the questions I think to be asked, both in Congress, but even more in the next election, is whether the American people care that its major elected officials are brazenly lying to them on a daily basis.
Yeah, I got to wrap. And I think we can conclude by saying I think it's also been proven with this report, this was not a witch hunt. I mean, there was a lot of substantive things here, questions that had to be answered based on, a lot of what's been said here. And I would encourage all of you out there, read the report. Don't just listen here. Don't just listen to the reactions. Read the report. It's there on the Department of Justice website. Lenny Steinhorn, Paul Schiff Berman, thank you very much for your insight.